Welcome to another special episode of 3-Minute Theologian, a theology podcast about what we believe, written by the pastors at Waukee Community Church. What makes this edition special is that I have Pastor Tank and Pastor Brooks with me. And I'm your host, of course, Mike Wagner. Today is our final episode of Season 2. And to finish the season, we're going to be talking about God and the problem of evil and suffering. To get things started, we're going to begin with a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's a well-known atheist, and he had this to say: "The more I look at the universe, the less convinced I am that something benevolent is going on. If your concept of a creator is someone who is all-powerful and all-good, and I look at disasters that afflict the earth, volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects, you look at this list of ways that life on earth is made miserable by natural causes, and I just ask, how do you deal with that?" So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, he is either not all-powerful or not all good. And that's where the quote ends. But that's not where this episode ends. I'm going to start with a question about the problem of evil. How can God allow evil? Why do bad things happen to good people?
You know, as Tank and I have been sitting here talking about this, and as we've been preparing for this episode, it occurs to me that every time I hear a quote like Neil deGrasse Tyson there by an atheist, it's as if the atheist is saying, no one has ever thought about this question before. Christians can't possibly answer this question. And the reality is Christians have been wrestling with this for thousands of years. And it seems like a conundrum. You know, how can God be all powerful and all good? Because if he's all good and all powerful, he would stop evil. And yet we have evil. So he must not be powerful or he must be evil. Which one is he? And I think as we look at this, Christians have answered this in kind of two ways. If you boil down all their arguments. One is called the free will argument. And basically the idea is this: God did not want to create robots or automatons who just simply acted without a will of their own. And so he created human beings with a will. And because we had a will, we could choose evil. And in fact, through our parents, Adam and Eve, we did choose evil. And so what happens then is the entire world was transformed for evil through that moment. And so, yeah, we have hurricanes and we have devastating natural disasters, and we have human beings who do horrible, unspeakable things to other human beings, all as a result of the choice that our forefathers made and that we continue to make. So that's just the basic idea, is that God didn't want automatons. He wanted people with a will. And we were given a will and we chose evil. Now, the other idea that's kind of connected here is this simple idea that human beings were created in a world that's the best of all possible worlds. The idea behind this argument is that if you would imagine a scenario in which there are infinite types of worlds, infinite scenarios, and God looked at this and said, I want to create a world with these inputs where people have a will and an ability to choose, knowing that they're going to choose evil. The best possible world is the one I'm going to create. And so, to some degree, this explains why evil is not as bad as it could be, because God created the best of all possible worlds.
Well, regardless of which angle you take on these, it sounds like they're somewhat similar, but they have different emphases. My question would be then, why do bad things still happen to good people?
Evil and suffering are a part of this world, but they're not natural. They're invaders of this world, like a plague, and they've affected everything around us. So while there are, yes, consequences for our actions, Christians are not fatalists. We're not deists, and we don't believe, like in karma, that we just automatically get what we deserve. Actually, quite the opposite. We believe in God's providence, that he is actively involved in this world and holding back evil and suffering. And that's what is creating the best possible world. We have the ability to make choices, but we are also always choosing poorly. And yet, we also don't just suffer without hope. God is in control, and we believe that God is still active in this world.
Okay, well, it sounds like we got a couple of things to look at. On the one hand, we need to pause and think about what is evil, and then we also then need to think about what is suffering. So let's start with evil. What is evil?
Yeah, so evil is the opposite of what's good. It's the opposite of what God intended. In the beginning, God said, I'm going to create this, and then he said, it is good. Evil ultimately then is the rejection of God and what he has created. It's opposed to what God desires, what God's will is. So life, the fruit of the Spirit, it's even the destruction of what is good. It's rebellion against what is good and what God desires and what ultimately brings God glory. That's what evil is.
Okay, that helps some, but then let's stay on this a bit. Is God responsible for evil?
Yeah, I think that's the question. If God could restrain evil and he
Exactly.
doesn't, is he responsible for it? And the answer is no. But God, he's not responsible for evil, but he does allow it. And this is an important distinction to make. Who's responsible for evil? Well, we as his creatures who have chosen evil, ultimately we are responsible for that. Satan, a created being who fell, he is responsible for evil. God is not responsible. We have a will and we have a responsibility for our actions. And the truth is, we do live in the midst of this spiritual war between good and evil, God being infinitely good, Satan being infinitely less powerful than God. And yet we live here where evil and suffering are a result of the fall, and we live in this present age where this is all happening. So no, God is not responsible for evil. We are responsible for evil.
Okay, that helps. We're understanding what evil is and where it came from and who's responsible for it. Let's turn to the other side of this conversation. What is suffering? What counts as suffering?
Yeah. Suffering is the result of evil. Suffering is the result of rejecting what is good and what God has intended. So I would argue that everything between a paper cut and flat-out persecution is something we can count as suffering. It's evil and suffering is at work in our relationships. We have conflict and discord between one another. We have diseases in this world and sickness. I'm getting over a cold right now. Maybe my throat sounds bad, or maybe to some of you it sounds better. I don't know how this works. But some of us have disabilities in this world, or weaknesses. We're born with handicaps and limitations. We're not living in lives and bodies that were meant to be like they were. Not to mention natural disasters and ultimately decay. Things break down, and death. Like, none of those are good. None of them.
If we make it personal, though, what am I to make of my suffering? Am I suffering because I sinned?
Yeah, that's a great question. I go to John chapter 9, and you got to listen to this exchange because this is exactly the question that Jesus addresses. So John chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "And he, Jesus, went along, and he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi,'" and look at their assumption here, right? Is it, "Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents that he was born blind?" So they have an assumption. Something's wrong, somebody sinned, and this is the payment or punishment for that sin. This is their assumption. It's karma-based, right? You did something bad, something's going to happen to you, or maybe to your kid. And so that's their assumption on this. And Jesus answers this question by shattering their assumptions. He says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. Okay, so then why did this happen? But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life.
So we're warned off of a simple cause-effect relationship here. Jesus saying something more complex is happening here, and a greater purpose is being served.
Yeah. Jesus also says in Luke chapter 13 something similar. In this time, he's talking to some crowds, and he brings up The fact that there had been some people who had been recently killed by Roman soldiers for something, and a tower had fallen on some other people and killed many. And Jesus says this in chapter 13, verse 4 of Luke. Do you think that these 18 people were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? Are these people who were killed and suffered, were they worse sinners? His answer then is no. Some suffering is by accident. Some suffering is a consequence, a legitimate consequences for something we do. We commit a crime, we go to jail. Some things also just happen for no apparent reason. God is up to something, and we don't have access. We don't have a view or understanding of what that is. And that's what happens to Job. That's probably one of the most famous occurrences of that in the Bible.
Yeah, Job is such an interesting book, and it's so complex with layers. It's probably the earliest writing that we have in Scripture. It's the oldest writing we have, and here these people are trying to figure out why people suffer. And so what Job never knows is what's happening in heaven. You know, in heaven, there's this conversation between Satan and God, and Satan is sort of challenging God. And there's this colossal thing that's happening, and Job never knows any of it. And he loses everything. He loses the suffering that Job, that happened to him is just unimaginable. And I love what Job says in Job 13. He says, though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. In other words, Job is saying at this point, I choose God. I choose God. Now, later on, Job starts demanding some answers from God, and God says, I don't have to answer to you.
Yeah.
But for now, in this point, I think Job is right in saying, like, I don't know. I don't understand. I wish God would answer me, but I'm going to trust him.
Okay, that raises another question, though. You look at Job, you look at others, you look at our own lives at times. Does God even care that I'm suffering?
The scriptures obviously make it show that God cares for us, but sometimes I've felt like, where does it explicitly say that in the Bible? And I finally found a verse, or more aptly, I heard someone tell me about a verse, and that's Psalm 56, verse 8. In different translations word it differently, but in my Bible, it says, you have kept count of my tossings. You put my tears in your bottle. Are not they in your book? Essentially, that verse is just saying, hey, God is aware, and he doesn't lose any of our suffering. He catches every one of our tears in a bottle. They're all on his record. He's not lost track of any of it.
Yeah, he cares deeply about every tear you shed. Wow. In John chapter 11, Lazarus died, and Lazarus' sisters come get Jesus. And, there's just grieving. They're just grieving. And so it says in verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then Jesus wept. Now, why is Jesus weeping? Like he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Like he's there. He's thinking about it. Why is he crying? Like this whole thing's about to be over. I think he's crying for two reasons. One, Jesus hates the pain that sin and death bring to this world. And two, he grieves with Mary and Martha as they grieve the loss of their brother. Lazarus was Jesus' friend too. And all the pain that this caused, God sees this and he hates it. And so I think, does God care about your suffering? Yeah, he cares deeply.
Okay, so we're getting some insight here in terms of what counts as suffering, and is it because of my sin? So we're seeing some relationship there. And we do recognize that God cares about suffering. But let's go back to some of the bigger questions maybe that we started with. If God is in control, what is his purpose of evil and suffering? We looked at evil and we looked at suffering. We know that God is sovereign. So what is his purpose for evil and suffering?
Yeah, Mike, this entire season we've been talking about God and his attributes, who he is, what he's like. We've talked about the fact that he is providential, he's sovereign, and we're even highlighting that in this episode, that nothing is happening outside of God's control. He's aware of every tear that we shed. It's grievous to him. But we have to also remember that God's word just accounts for us his plan. God has a purpose for everything, even evil. That's what Proverbs chapter 16, verse 4 has said. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. That just tells me that God is in control and he has a purpose for my suffering, the bad things that happen in this world, and that ultimately they're going to bring him glory. And we have already mentioned John 11, where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. He weeps at that time, but it also points ahead to the fact that Jesus is going to defeat sin, death, and evil. And all these things are going to show his glory and show the glory and goodness and the greatness of God.
And I think, as we said earlier, God could have not created this world. He could have just said, nope, I see what's going to happen. I'm not doing that. No. But somehow the world in which God created brings him more glory, because the story of him defeating evil is better than no story at all. That's beautiful. It reminds me of Genesis chapter 50. At the end of Joseph's life, think of all the terrible things that happened to Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery. That's a difficult family reunion, right? When you do that.
It was.
Yeah, and it was a difficult one. And, he ends up a slave, he ends up a prisoner, and eventually he ends up as the number 2 in all of Egypt, and his brothers come groveling to him. And so at the end of Genesis, when this whole story is resolved, his brothers come back to Joseph, and they're like, hey, we know it's been a few years now, and it seems like you forgave us and all, but just in case you didn't know, Dad said you had to. Before he died, he said you had to.
Yeah, don't be mean.
Yeah, and so Joseph realizes that they don't trust his forgiveness.
They're scared.
And so he says this to them in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." If we could just tattoo that verse over this whole conversation, if I could do that somehow, because it gets to what God is doing. He's taking the ugliest, the messiest, the just grossest and most perverse things that the enemy brings at us. And he's saying to the enemy, yeah, you just watch this. I'm going to do something good. Bring your worst, and I will turn that, and I will do something good with it. And that's what Joseph recognized. So is God in control? Yeah, absolutely. He's taking evil and doing something good.
So we bring it back down again to kind of our own experience and our circumstances in our life. What is God's will for me in my suffering? How can I even know what this is all about?
Yeah. It depends. Some suffering is a test, like it was for Job. In that instance, we should be faithful even though we don't understand. Some suffering is for discipline. And in that instance, we should respond to his correction with obedience. And then I've always been struck by this passage in Romans chapter 12. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's God's will for us as we suffer. Don't respond to evil with more evil. Glorify God by pointing people to Jesus. Glorify God by being resolved in hope of the gospel. Overcome evil with good.
You just said something, Tank, that helps me formulate the last question, as often is the case, everything comes back to Jesus. Everything comes back to the gospel. So how does the gospel help us answer the problem of evil and suffering?
Well, yeah, because the good news is that Jesus defeats sin. I mean, if anybody has the ability to understand suffering, it's God himself, who became a man and had the worst suffering that has ever existed poured out on Jesus on the cross. Like, God understands suffering. God understands evil. And the beauty of the gospel is that he defeated it. He endured it and he defeated it. And so through his death and through his resurrection, he put the shackles on Satan, the author, the father of evil and lies. He put the shackles on him, and one day we wait till he eternally defeats Satan. We have this hope. The gospel gives us hope that anything I face ultimately has been defeated by Jesus and will be defeated by Jesus. And that's beautiful.
This has been pretty amazing, and as much as we may want to congratulate ourselves that we have covered all of the bases, I've got to believe that there are other resources out there that we could turn to that those who are listening might check out to be able to keep this conversation alive in their own thinking in life.
If you want to go deeper into this topic, a couple places to start might be Paul Tripp, just the simple title of Suffering, Gospel Hope When Life Doesn't Make Sense. That's just a good book on how do I deal with suffering. If you're looking for more of a theology proper on suffering, I would recommend D.A. Carson, How Long, O Lord?
And I'd also throw in there C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little book that I think, Lewis is just a master and does a great job.
He's just Lewis.
Yeah. And then there's a book by John Feinberg called The Many Faces of Evil. If you want a real heady, dive into this in a real heady place, it's excellent. And he really tackles this concept of the best of all possible worlds in that book.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great conversation, a lively one. And, as I think about maybe wrapping things up, I want to read from Romans chapter 5. We've had a couple of references to the letter to the Romans. Seems like it answers a lot of great questions. In chapter 5, verse 3, it says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. Thank you for listening to the 3-Minute Theologian, a podcast of Waukee Community Church. Season 2 has been written and produced by pastors David Brooks and David Tank. Special thanks to our narrators Mike Wagner, Molly Flinkman, Jess Savage, and Jennifer Crow. Transcripts of these episodes can be found on our church website at www.waukeecommunitychurch.com/ministries. If you do not have a church home or are in the Des Moines area, we invite you to join us for the worship gathering of Waukee Community Church, 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Our mission is to make disciples who live, love, and give like Jesus, and to bring others together to do the same. Until next time, please like and subscribe to the 3-Minute Theologian on your favorite broadcast platform.